It was a Friday evening, and the kind of cold that makes you pull your coat a little tighter and walk a little faster. The streets outside were quiet, but inside the old community hall on the edge of the city, things were just starting to warm up. People were coming in one by one, shaking the chill off their shoulders, finding their seats, looking around the way people do when they're somewhere slightly unfamiliar. Some were parents, some were music students, a few were teachers, and then there were the others, the ones who had no real reason to be there, who had shown up simply because someone had handed them a free ticket and the evening had nothing better to offer. Maya was one of those people. She was 14, quiet by nature, and wearing a jacket that was just a little too big for her, the kind you borrow from an older sibling and never quite give back. She had come because her classmate, Priya, had waved a spare ticket in her face that afternoon and said, "Just come, it'll be something to do." Maya had shrugged and taken it. She had no real interest in concerts or performances. She just didn't want to spend another Friday evening sitting alone in her room. She found a seat near the back, close to the aisle, which felt safer somehow. If it got boring, she could leave without making a scene. She set her small bag on her lap, looked up at the stage, and waited. The hall itself was nothing fancy. It wasn't one of those grand theaters with golden ceilings and red curtains. It was a regular community space, wooden floors, rows of plastic chairs dressed up with thin cushions, and a stage that had clearly seen better days. But someone had made an effort. There were warm lights pointing at the stage, and right in the center of it, under those lights, sat a piano. It was a dark, upright grand piano, old but clearly polished for the occasion. It almost looked out of place in that room, like something expensive sitting in an ordinary living room. Maya noticed it the moment she sat down. She wasn't sure why, but her eyes kept coming back to it. The evening started the usual way these things do. A man in a slightly wrinkled blazer walked to the center of the stage and welcomed everyone warmly. He cracked a small joke that got a soft laugh from the crowd. He explained that the evening was a showcase, a mix of young performers and a few surprises. The audience clapped politely. Phones came out. People settled in. The first few performances were fine. A young boy played a short violin piece and took a very serious bow at the end, which made the parents in the front rows smile. A girl sang a folk song with a voice that was sweet and clear. A duo played a piece together that wasn't quite in sync, but was full of effort, and the audience gave them every bit of encouragement they deserved. Maya watched it all from the back. She clapped when others clapped. She didn't check her phone the way some of the teenagers around her were doing. She just sat there, watching, her eyes drifting back to that piano every few minutes even when nobody was playing it. There was something about it she couldn't explain. She didn't know much about music. She didn't come from a musical family. Her mother worked long shifts at a clothing store, and her father had been out of the picture for years. Nobody in her house had ever owned an instrument. And yet something about that piano sitting there under those warm lights made her feel a kind of pull, the same way you feel when you see something beautiful that you don't quite have the words for. She pressed her hands together in her lap and looked away. Around her, the hall hummed with that particular kind of background noise that belongs only to live events. Whispered conversations. A baby making soft sounds somewhere near the middle rows. The shuffle of programs being folded and unfolded. The distant hum of the building's old heating system fighting the cold outside. Maya shifted slightly in her seat. The performance on stage changed again. Another young student, another song. She listened without really listening. Her mind had gone somewhere quieter, somewhere further away. She thought about the week she'd had. A difficult exam. Agreement with her mother over something small that had somehow grown bigger than it should have. The feeling she carried around most days. Not of sadness exactly, but of being somewhere on the outside of things. Watching life happen to other people while she stood just slightly apart from it. She wasn't unhappy. She just felt invisible sometimes, like she moved through the world without leaving much of a mark on it. She looked up at the stage again. The piano was still sitting there. She had no idea, not even the faintest idea, that in less than 30 minutes she would be sitting at it, that the lights would be on her, that the entire room would be listening. She had no idea that the evening she had almost stayed home for, the ticket she had almost turned down, the seat she had chosen specifically, because it was close to the exit, all of it was about to lead somewhere she had never imagined for herself. But that's the thing about certain nights. They don't look like anything special when they begin. The sky doesn't change color. No music plays. There's no sign or signal that something is coming. You're just sitting in a plastic chair in a borrowed jacket, a little cold, a little tired, thinking about nothing in particular. And then everything changes. Maya shifted once more in her seat, tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear, and turned her eyes back to the stage, just as the host returned to the microphone with a wide smile and a slightly mischievous look on his face. Something, she felt, was about to happen. She just didn't know it was going to happen to her. The host was a man who had clearly done this many times before. You could tell by the way he held the microphone, loose, comfortable, like it was just an extension of his hand. He had the kind of face that made people trust him immediately. Warm eyes, a calm voice, and a smile that never looked forced. His name was Mr. Aussay, and he had been teaching music in this city for nearly 25 years. He stood at the center of the stage and let the applause from the previous performance settle down before he spoke. "Now," he said, drawing the word out just a little, the way people do when they're about to say something they find amusing. "We're going to do something a little different." A few people in the crowd exchanged glances. Someone near the front sat up straighter. "Every time we do one of these evenings," Mr. Aussay continued, "it's always the same. The performers perform, the audience watches, everyone goes home." He paused. "But tonight, I want to break that a little." He turned slightly and gestured toward the piano behind him. "I want someone from the audience to come up here and sit at this piano." The room stirred. A few soft laughs. A couple of surprised murmurs. "Now, before anyone panics," he added quickly, "I'm not asking for a concert. I'm not asking for perfection. I just want someone to come up, sit down, and play whatever they feel like playing. Even one note. That's enough." He smiled again and looked out at the crowd. Several hands went up immediately. A young boy near the middle. A woman in her 30s who was already half out of her seat. 2 teenage girls in the 3rd row, whispering to each other and giggling. Mr. Aussay looked around the room slowly. Not the way a teacher picks someone to answer a question, but the way someone looks when they're actually searching for something specific. His eyes moved across the rows, passed over the eager hands, and kept going. And then they stopped. Right at the back. Right at Maya. She wasn't raising her hand. She wasn't smiling or leaning forward. She was just sitting there, very still, with her hands folded in her lap and her eyes fixed on the piano with an expression that Mr. Aussay had seen only a handful of times in his long career. It wasn't admiration from a distance. It wasn't casual curiosity. It was something deeper than both of those things. The look of someone who already had a relationship with something, even if nobody else in the room knew it yet. He pointed gently in her direction. "You," he said. The young lady in the back. Maya's stomach dropped. She looked to her left, then her right, certain he must mean someone else. But the people around her were all looking at her. Priya, sitting 2 seats away, gave her a little nudge on the arm and whispered, "Go." Maya shook her head slightly. A small, almost invisible shake. The kind that means asterisk, please, not me. Asterisk. But Mr. Aussay was still looking at her, still smiling, and there was nothing unkind in his expression, just patience and certainty, as if he already knew something she didn't. "Come on," he said, his voice easy and unhurried. "Don't be shy." There's no wrong answer up here. The audience turned to look. Not in a harsh way, not the way a crowd can sometimes feel like pressure, but enough that staying in her seat was no longer really an option. Maya stood up slowly. The walk from the back of the hall to the stage felt longer than it had any right to feel. Each step on the wooden floor seemed louder than the last. She kept her eyes down, counting the rows as she passed them. She was aware of people watching, aware of the quiet that had settled over the room, that particular soft quiet of an audience waiting to see what comes next. She reached the stairs at the side of the stage, climbed them carefully, and stepped into the light. Up close, the piano was even larger than it had looked from her seat. She stood beside it for a moment, not quite touching it, as if she needed a second to get used to being that near to it. Mr. Osei stepped closer and gestured warmly to the bench. "Go ahead," he said quietly, just for her. "Sit down. Take your time." She sat. The bench was harder than she expected. She adjusted herself once, then went still. Her hands rested on her thighs. She looked at the keys, all of them white and black and perfectly lined up, waiting. From the audience, she must have looked nervous. She was nervous. Her heart was doing something unreasonable in her chest. But underneath the nerves, underneath all the self-consciousness of being watched by a room full of strangers, something else was happening, something quieter, something that had been there a long time. The moment she sat in front of those keys, a kind of calm started to move through her, slow, like warm water, like coming inside after a long time out in the cold. She had felt this before, not on a stage, never on a stage, but in the small hours of the night, sitting in front of an old second-hand keyboard she kept pushed under her bed, headphones in, the rest of the house asleep. In those hours, when no one was watching and no one expected anything, she played. She had always played. Since she was 7 years old and had watched a video online of a woman performing a piece so beautiful it had made her cry without fully understanding why. No teacher had ever shown her where to put her fingers. No one had ever explained music theory to her, or corrected her posture, or told her what to practice. She had simply listened, and watched, and tried, and listened again. For 7 years, that was all it had ever been. A private thing. A secret she kept not out of shame, but because it had never occurred to her that it could be anything more. She looked down at the keys again. The room was completely quiet now, and Maya, for the first time in her life, placed her hands where they had always belonged and prepared to play. For a moment, she just breathed. Her hands were resting on the edge of the keys, not pressing anything yet, just feeling the cool smoothness of the ivory beneath her fingertips. The stage lights were warmer than she expected. Not blinding, but present. The kind of light that makes you very aware that you exist, that you are somewhere, that people are looking at you. She could hear the audience. Not noise exactly, but the sound of people being still. The faint shift of someone in their seat. A quiet cough near the back. The soft hum of the building around them all. And underneath all of it, silence. The kind that only a room full of waiting people can produce. She didn't look up. She had learned long ago, in those late nights alone with her keyboard, that looking at things too much could get in the way. Looking at your hands made them stiff. Looking at the keys made you second-guess yourself. The best way, she had found, was to close out everything else and just listen inward, to the thing inside you that already knew what it wanted to say. So that's what she did. She closed her eyes for just a second, and then she began to play. The first few notes came out soft, almost hesitant. A gentle stepping into something, the way you test the temperature of water before you go in fully. The notes climbed and then fell, slow and careful, and if you didn't know what was coming, you might have thought it was just a girl finding her footing. But then something changed. It's hard to explain exactly what happens in the moment. A performance stops being a performance and becomes something else. There isn't a single dramatic note or a sudden shift in volume. It's more like watching a light come on in a window at dusk, gradual, then undeniable. One moment the room is waiting, and the next moment the room is listening. Really listening. The kind of listening that makes you forget to check your phone, forget the time, forget the small worries you walked in carrying. That was the moment Maya stopped being nervous. Her shoulders dropped, her breathing steadied. Her fingers, which had been moving carefully, began to move freely, the way they always did when it was just her, and the keyboard, and the dark, and the night. The music that came out of that piano was Chopin, a nocturne, one of those slow, quiet, deeply feeling pieces that seemed to carry weight without ever being heavy. It moved through the room like something living, filling every corner, touching things that were difficult to name. People in the audience started to go very still. A woman in the fourth row, who had spent the first half of the evening scrolling quietly through her phone, set the phone face down on her lap without thinking. She didn't notice she'd done it until much later. A father near the window, who had brought his young son to the show and spent most of the night managing the boy's restlessness, found that his son had gone completely quiet, sitting upright, eyes wide, staring at the stage with an expression children only get when something reaches them in a way they don't yet have words for. Mr. Usse stood to the side of the stage. He had stepped back to give Maya space, expecting to return to the microphone within a minute or two, expecting a few sweet notes, and then an encouraging round of applause. That was how these moments usually went. Someone from the audience came up, played something small, the room clapped warmly, and the evening moved on. But he hadn't moved back to the microphone. He was standing very still, arms loose at his sides, watching Maya with an expression no one in the audience could fully read from where they sat. It was the expression of a man doing a quiet kind of recalculating. 25 years of teaching music, hundreds of students, dozens of performances just like this one. And yet something about what he was hearing right now was making him recalibrate everything he had assumed about the next 10 minutes. Her technique wasn't perfect. He noticed that with the part of his brain that was always a teacher. Her posture could be better. There were small things, tiny things, that formal training would have smoothed out long ago. But there was something else happening that technique alone could never produce. There was feeling in every phrase. Real, unforced feeling. The kind that only comes from someone who learned music, not as a subject, but as a language, as the only available way to say things that couldn't be said out loud. He didn't move. Nobody moved. Even the young performers who had already finished their sets and were waiting backstage had crept quietly to the side of the curtain to look. 2 of them stood shoulder to shoulder in the dim, watching the girl on the bench, with expressions somewhere between disbelief and something close to awe. One of them leaned slightly toward the other and opened his mouth to say something, then closed it again. There were no words that felt right for the moment, so they just watched. Maya, for her part, was somewhere else entirely. She wasn't on a stage anymore. She wasn't in a hall full of people. She wasn't in a borrowed jacket with her bag sitting abandoned on a plastic chair at the back of the room. She was in the only place she had ever felt completely like herself, inside the music, inside the space where nothing was required of her except to feel and to follow and to let her hands do what they had been quietly learning to do for 7 years in the dark. The piece moved through its middle passage, a section that swells just slightly before it pulls back into something more fragile. Her hands moved with it. The notes rose, hung in the air for just a breath, and then came back down like something settling. The room held on. Every single person in that hall, without being asked, without even deciding to, was holding on, leaning into the music, following it, giving it every bit of their attention. And none of them, not one, wanted it to stop. The last note lasted longer than most people expected. It didn't cut off. It didn't rush toward its ending the way nervous performers sometimes do, anxious to be finished, anxious to step back from the light. It simply faded, the way a candle goes out when there's no wind slowly, gently taking its time, until there was nothing left of it but the memory of the sound hanging somewhere in the warm air of the hall. Maya's hands stayed on the keys for a moment after. She wasn't posing. She wasn't holding the moment for effect. She was just still, coming back. The way you feel when you've been very far away inside your own mind and the world slowly returns around you. The lights, the bench, the faint smell of old wood and floor polish, the weight of her own hands. And then she heard it. Or rather, she didn't, because for the first 5 seconds after the music ended, the hall was completely silent. Not politely quiet. Not the brief pause before an audience decides to clap. Genuinely, deeply silent. The kind of silence that a room full of people produces only when something has reached all of them at exactly the same time. When there are no words yet, because the words haven't caught up. Maya looked up from the keys for the first time since she had started playing. She looked out at the audience and saw faces she didn't recognize, looking back at her with expressions she didn't quite know how to read. The woman in the 4th row still had her phone face down in her lap. A man near the aisle had his hand pressed loosely over his mouth, not quite covering it. An elderly couple in the 3rd row were looking at each other the way people do when they want to confirm that the other person felt the same thing. A glance that said, asterisk, did you hear that? Was that real? Was that really just now? Asterisk, and then, from somewhere near the front, a single pair of hands began to clap. Slow at first, deliberate, not the automatic applause of a polite audience going through the motions, but something more intentional than that. The kind of clapping that means asterisk, I am choosing to do this, because what just happened deserves it. Asterisk, then another pair joined. Then 3 more. Then it spread across the room the way warmth spreads, row by row, until the entire hall was on its feet. Maya sat frozen on the bench. She had never heard that sound aimed at her before. She had heard applause from this same seat tonight, directed at other people on this same stage, and it had sounded ordinary, the expected ending to a performance. But this was different, and she felt the difference in her chest before she understood it in her mind. This wasn't polite. This wasn't automatic. This was a room full of people telling her something. And even though she had no experience receiving it, some part of her understood exactly what they were saying. She didn't know what to do with her hands. She pressed them together in her lap. She looked down at the floor of the stage for a moment, then back up. Her eyes were bright. Not crying, not yet, but close to that edge where feeling gets so large he has nowhere else to go. Mr. Aze walked toward her from the side of the stage. He moved unhurriedly, the way he did everything, but his face was different now from the easy, relaxed expression he'd worn at the start of the evening. There was something quieter in it, more careful. The look of a man who has just witnessed something that has rearranged a small part of how he sees the world. He stopped beside the piano and waited for the applause to settle, just slightly, not fully, before he crouched down a little, so he was closer to her level, and asked her something in a low voice that the people in the first few rows could just barely make out. How long have you been playing? Maya looked at him. She swallowed once. 7 years, she said. Mr. Ace held her gaze for a moment. Then, very quietly, he asked the follow-up question, the one that, when people later repeated this story to others, always got the same reaction. Who taught you? And Maya, in a voice that was soft but steady, said the words that made the front row go still all over again. Nobody. I taught myself. I used to watch videos online and then go home and try to copy what I heard. There were a few seconds where Mr. Ace simply looked at her, not with disbelief exactly, more like a man carefully turning something over in his hands, checking it from every angle, making sure he understood what he was holding. Then he stood up, turned to the audience, and repeated what she had said into the microphone. The reaction was immediate. A fresh wave of sound, not just applause this time, but voices, actual exclamations. a kind of noise a crowd makes when something surprises them beyond the point of polite response. Someone near the back said something that got swallowed by the noise around them. The young performers backstage, who had been listening through the curtain, broke into their own small commotion. Priya, sitting near the back where Maya had left her bag, had both hands pressed over her mouth. She had known Maya for 2 years. They had eaten lunch together dozens of times, walked home the same direction, shared notes before exams. And she had never known. Not once had Maya mentioned it. Not once had she let it slip. Priya thought about all those ordinary afternoons, all those unremarkable conversations, and felt something strange and wonderful. The realization that the person you think you know completely can still hold something extraordinary inside them, quietly without anyone ever seeing it. On stage, Maya sat in the middle of all of it. The noise, the lights, the standing crowd, the questions she could sense were coming and felt. For the first time in a long time, not invisible. Not invisible at all. For the first time, she felt entirely, completely, undeniably seen. The evening eventually ended the way all evenings do. The lights came up slowly. People gathered their coats and their bags. Conversations broke out across the rows, the kind that happen after something unexpected, where strangers who didn't speak a word to each other an hour ago are now turning to one another with wide eyes, saying, "Asterisk, did you see that? Can you believe that? Who was that girl?" Asterisk Maya came down from the stage on unsteady legs. Not because anything was wrong, just because her body hadn't quite caught up with everything that had happened in the last 20 minutes. Her mind was still somewhere back on that bench, somewhere inside that music, and the rest of her was slowly making its way back to the ordinary world, to the wooden floor, to the noise of people around her, to Priya, rushing toward her from the back of the hall with an expression that was equal parts shock and pure delight. Priya grabbed both of her arms and stared at her. Maya. That was all she said at first, just her name. Like she was checking that it was still the same person. Maya laughed, a small, slightly overwhelmed laugh, and Priya pulled her into a hug that said everything words could unquite manage. Before they could say much more, people started approaching. Not in an aggressive way, not crowding her, but one by one and in small pairs, audience members who wanted to say something, who felt they needed to. An older woman with kind eyes told her that she hadn't heard anything like that in a very long time. A father with his young son stopped just long enough for the boy to look up at Maya and say, in the most serious voice a child can produce, "Asterisk, I want to learn that." Asterisk, his father smiled apologetically, as if the boy had said something embarrassing. But Maya shook her head and told the boy that he should, that it wasn't as hard as it looked at you just to start. She meant it. Mr. S.E. found her near the side door about 15 minutes later, just as the hall was beginning to empty out. He was carrying a small notebook, which she noticed but didn't ask about. He asked if she had a few minutes, and something in his tone made it clear this wasn't a casual question, that whatever he wanted to say, he had been thinking about it carefully since the moment she had stepped off the stage. They sat on 2 chairs near the edge of the room, while the last of the audience filtered out around them. He asked her about her keyboard at home, the second-hand one she mentioned to someone in passing. He asked how often she played. He asked if she'd ever tried to get formal lessons, and when she shook her head and explained quietly that it hadn't ever really been an option, that money was tight, that her mother worked hard just to keep things steady, that music had always felt like something other people got to pursue seriously. Mr. Osei listened without interrupting. He didn't offer pity. She wouldn't have wanted that, and somehow he understood it without being told. What he offered instead was something practical and direct. He knew a music instructor, someone he had worked with for many years, a serious and gifted teacher who occasionally took on students outside the usual system, students who couldn't afford the standard fees. He couldn't promise anything tonight, he said, but he was going to make a phone call in the morning. And he was going to ask. Maya looked at him for a long moment. She had spent so long keeping this part of herself tucked away, not out of shame, but out of a kind of quiet self-protection, the kind that builds up slowly in people who have learned not to expect too much, who have learned that wanting something too openly can make the wanting hurt more when it doesn't come through. She had loved music for 7 years, without ever letting herself believe it could be anything more than a private thing, a late-night thing, something that belonged only to the space between her headphones. She nodded, carefully, like she was handling something fragile. "Thank you," she said. It was a small thing to say, but the way she said it carried the weight of everything she didn't say out loud. What nobody in that room knew, what Maya herself had no way of knowing yet, was that the evening wasn't finished with her. Not even close. A parent who had been sitting in the 7th row that night, a quiet man who worked in tech and had brought his daughter to the showcase on a whim, had taken out his phone during Maya's performance. Not to scroll, not to check messages, but to record. Just a minute or so of video, shaky and imperfect, the kind taken in the dark by someone who isn't thinking about framing or quality, but simply doesn't want the moment to disappear. He posted it that night, before he went to sleep. Nothing fancy. A short caption. Something like, "Girl from the audience asked to play the piano." Nobody was ready for this. By the time Maya woke up the next morning and looked at her phone, she had 17 missed messages from Priya alone. The video had found its way across the internet, the way certain things do. Not pushed, not forced, just shared by one person, and then another, and then thousands of others, each of them feeling in 30 seconds what the audience had felt in real time, each of them stopping their scroll because something about it cut through the noise and landed somewhere genuine. Comments filled up. People from different countries, different languages, different lives, all saying versions of the same thing. That it moved them. That they'd watched it twice, 3 times. That there was something about it they couldn't explain, but didn't want to stop feeling. Maya sat on the edge of her bed that morning, still in her pajamas, reading through messages that didn't seem real. Her mother came to the doorway, still in her work clothes from the early shift, holding her own phone with a stunned expression. Neither of them said anything for a moment. Then her mother crossed the room, sat beside her on the bed, and put an arm around her daughter's shoulders, the way she used to when Maya was very small and the world felt too large. "I didn't know," her mother said softly. Maya leaned into her. "I know," she said. "I think I was waiting until I was sure." Outside, the morning was ordinary. Cold sky, quiet street, the distant sound of the city starting its day. But inside that small room, something had shifted, not loudly, not dramatically, but in the deep and permanent way that real things shift. A door had opened, not just for the world to see Maya, but for Maya to finally see herself. And this time, she was ready to walk through it.